we have surveyed the rise of historiography in various parts of the world. Now we intend to take up how the historiography evolved, modern historiography I mean, evolved, and from where it started and what were the factors which led to the development of the new kind of historiography, which will be a departure from what we have discussed up to now. That's why I use the epithet called modern historiography. What is modern about it? So we as the title would show, rise of modern historiography, meaning thereby that there is something which will happen which did not happen earlier, and that will be identified as modern. So a modern historiography, in other words, would signify certain new stages of development in writing history, with new focus, with new tools, with new parameters, and with new objectives. So the evolution of modern historiography goes back to the Renaissance period in Western Europe, say in the beginning of the 18th, beginning with 14th century, and it coincides with decline of feudalism as a political ideology. So that's why we are calling it modern. Until the 19th century, it was more or less confined to Western Europe, but towards the close of the century, I mean 19th century, it began to become a worldwide phenomenon, carrying a universal significance in the entire world. By the 4th century AD, Western Europe had lost all contacts with the Greco-Roman tradition. There was, this tradition continued, though in its degenerate form, in the Byzantine Empire. But then even the Byzantine Empire lost all contacts with the rest of Europe sometime while approaching the medieval period of European history. History writing in medieval Europe was reduced to writing of annals. Annals, I told you, was the beginning of historiography. Year by year account of the events, generally, though not exclusively, written by the clergy. Clergy means the people associated with the church. Besides annals, hagiologies were also written. Hagiologies were the lives of saints, obviously written for their glorification. Though largely mythical, these were written with a primitive consciousness of history. Why I am calling it primitive? Because it deals with myths which were mixed up with the narration of history, facts of history. Generally, I won't say it is the normal. Generally, what happens with hagiologies is that when they are dealing with any life of any saint or holy person, they do invent certain stories in order to make his profile more acceptable to his followers. He should have some divine qualities with him. So that attempt goes to mystify the thing. So medieval Europe therefore saw very little secular writing. There was almost no political history, not to mention social or economic history. It was in such a situation that things began to change in the 14th century, as I said earlier, that is the watershed. These changes are known to today's historians as Renaissance. Various explanations have been provided to explain the origins of Renaissance. That is not our, that doesn't fall in our purview, but nevertheless, we will have to take some of the arguments in cognition. One popular explanation has been that conquest of Constantinople in 1453 by the Turks led to the flight of scholars to Italy, thereby causing Renaissance in Italy. But the changes associated with the Renaissance antedate 1453, much before that. Its origins have therefore been to be sought in the socio-economic developments occurring in Western Europe, more significantly in Italy and other areas on the littoral of the Mediterranean. One development was the growth of trade and commerce on the Mediterranean Sea, leading to a large inflow of wealth into Italy, because this is the period when Italy would be gaining. This wealth encouraged the emergence of a new class of rich merchants and traders, popes and clergy, and a section of officials. These rich people, seeking a different style of life, began on to insist on pre-Christian glory of Rome, giving patronage to artisans, masons, artists, and men of literature trained in or impressed by the Greco-Roman tradition of art, architecture, and literature. In encouraging such a development, a significant role was played by the influx of Greek knowledge through Islamic influence. Almost all Greek texts reach Europe via a series of translations. These texts were first translated into Syriac, thereafter into Arabic, and from Arabic into Latin. This was the full circle course. Thus, whereas the Catholic Church was promoting in isolation a monastic church dominated Christian culture, there was also emerging a disturbing trend of retrieving the glories of pre-Christian Greco-Roman civilization. This trend, once it spread out from the domains of art and architecture to the field of thought, was marked by two characteristic features. These features were unique to the Italian Renaissance in that they distinguish it from the reverence of Greek learning in Islamic civilization. One, a return to pre-Christian glories. When this kind of desire was expressed, that meant or implied an acceptance of the fact that large achievements could be made by the human civilization without church and Christianity. The period thus saw a growing skepticism towards Christianity and subordination of religious principles to secular ideals. Secondly, an appreciation of the evolution of Greek thought by a twin process of rejection and acceptance led the Renaissance thinkers not to stop at where Greek learning had left us, in a posture of reverence and obscurantist adoration, as had happened in the Islamic world, but to considerably improve upon their learning by putting them to objective tests of criticism and analysis, and by utilizing their knowledge for further research. In this context, the contribution of Italian thinkers are considerable. Now, as I was saying that there were many scholars, there is a departure. Instead of blind faith and blind following, now they started questioning the efficacy of the previous Christian or church dominated, not to say Christian, church dominated thoughts. So now there is a new trend which will be questioning it, and that will give rise to the growth of rationalism in Western Europe. That will be one of the core building block of Renaissance. That will help, that will assist in revisiting the previous thoughts. And as I said earlier, when they are looking towards Greece and Greco-Roman achievements, then they are contrasting the two, what they achieved under the Greco-Roman Empire and what they lost under the church-dominated arrangement. So there were many, but we will take some of the representative cases, some of the cases which will be illustrative of those achievements, hallmark achievements, I would say, and first gentleman who will come to our, who will attract our attention is Petrarch. He was born in period is 1304 to 1374. So it's very obvious he had a lifespan of 70 years. He was born July 20th, 1304, Arezzo, Tuscany in Italy, and died a day, before he was born. It will look very interesting in the sense that this is just a coincidence. He died on July 18th or 19th, 1374 at Arqua near Padua, Carrara. Carrara, I must say that Carrara is the place from where you get the Italian marbles. They are white marbles and you can see them dazzling in the bright daylight. So this gentleman is also a dazzling light of Renaissance. He was an Italian scholar, poet and humanist whose poems addressed to Laura, an idealized beloved, contributed to the Renaissance flowering of lyric poetry. Petrarch's inquiring mind and love of classical authors led him to travel a large part of the Greco-Roman world, visiting men of learning, searching monastic libraries for classical manuscripts. He was regarded as the greatest scholars of his age. Essentially a Greek, he was a great admirer of Latin, revived Latin poetry, but also wrote in the Italian language. He is in fact the first gentleman who is writing in vernacular language, and he is the one leading light who will be giving the vernacular identity to certain places, and from there onwards you will find that state powers would be emerging on linguistic lines. So he is initiating that. His Africa, an epic poem on the subject of the Second Punic War, is perhaps the first daunting formulations of the belief, not untrue, that there had been a decline in European culture since the time of the Roman Empire. Romans, according to him, represented the apex, and their decline meant the coming of the Dark Ages. He did not have the courage of attributing this decline to Christianity, but this is implicit in his writings, in his ages, in his appreciation of the Roman Republic as against the Roman Empire, which was tainted by Christianity. In fact, this appreciation by its very logic meant a rejection of Catholic culture and Christian heritage. Second major contribution to Petrarch lies in initiating the concept of nation for the first time in Western Europe. His poem, My Italy, may be characterized as the first national song, national anthem. He therefore provided the framework for writing a history of a nation as against that of Christendom. This is a big departure. Petrarch's father, he was a lawyer and had been obliged to leave Florence in 1302 and had moved to Arezzo, where Petrarch was born. The family eventually moved to Avignon, 1312, in the Provence region of southern France, the home of the exiled papal court, at which an Italian lawyer might hope to find employment. Petrarch's first studies were at Carpentras, France, and at father's insistence he was sent to study law at Montpellier, France, 1316. From there he returned to Italy with his younger brother Gerardo to continue these studies at Bologna, 1320, but already he was developing what in a letter in one of his epistles he described as an unquenchable thirst for literature. Unquenchable thirst for literature. He himself is admitting, as if he was sucked into that. Petrarch's earlier surviving poems on the death of his mother date from the Montpellier and Bologna period, though like all Petrarch's work, they were heavily revised later. Meanwhile, his knowledge and love of classical authors increasing, uh, he made his acquaintance with the new vernacular poetry that was being written. After his father's death in 1326, Petrarch was free to abandon his law studies and pursue his own interests. Returning to Avignon, he took minor ecclesiastical orders and entered the household of the influential Cardinal Giovanni Colonna. Petrarch enjoyed life in Avignon, and there is a famous description of him and his brother as dandies in its polished courtly world, but he was also making a name there for his scholarship and the elegance of his culture. As well as love of literature, Petrarch also had during his early youth a deep religious faith, a love of virtue, and an unusually deep perception of the transitory nature of human affairs. Now he is turning towards philosophical orientation. There now followed the reaction, a period of dissipation, which also coincided with the beginning of his famous, chaste love for a woman known only as Laura. Vain attempts have been made to identify her, but Petrarch himself kept silent about everything concerning her civil status, as though he thought it unimportant. He first saw her in the church of Saint Clare at Avignon on April 6, 1327, and loved her, although she was outside his reach, almost until his death. From this love there springs the work for which he is most celebrated, the Italian poems, rhyme, which he affected to despise as mere trifles in the vulgar tongue, but which he collected and revised throughout his life. That was a lifelong process. He spent the summer of 1330 at Lombez, France, the bishop of which was an old friend from Bologna. His name was Giacomo Colonna. In 1335, he received a canonry there, but continued to reside at Avignon in the service of the cardinal, with whom he stayed until 1337, 2 years. Quite apart from his love for Laura, this period was an important one for Petrarch. These were the years of ambition and unremitting study, notably in the field of classical Latin. They were also years of travel. In 1333, his journeying took him through France, Flanders, Brabant, and the Rhineland, where he visited men of learning and searched monastic libraries for the lost classical manuscripts, lost within quote. If they were totally lost, then how could he find them? So, they were believed to have been lost. In Liege, he discovered copies of 2 speeches by Cicero. This is a very wonderful discovery. In Paris, he was given a copy of the Confessions of St. Augustine by a friend and a spiritual confidant, the Augustinian monk Diongi of Saint-Sepulchre, and he was to use this more and more as the brevity of his spiritual life. These experiences bring Petrarch's mission as a stubborn advocate of continuity between classical culture and the Christian message more sharply into focus. By making a synthesis of the two seemingly conflicting ideals, regarding one as the rich promise and the other as the divine fulfillment, he can claim to be the founder and great representative of the movement known as European humanism. He rejected the sterile argumentation and endless dialectical subtleties to which medieval scholasticism had become a prey, and turned back for values and illumination to the moral weight of the classical medieval medieval world. In 1337, he visited Rome for the first time to be stirred among its ruins by the evident grandeur of its past. The monuments were unfolding before his eyes as documents of the time. On returning to Avignon, he sought a refuge from its corrupt life. The papacy at this time was wholly absorbed in secular matters, and a few miles to the east found his fair transalpine solitude of Vaucluse, which was afterward to become a much loved place of retreat. The chronology of Petrarch's writing is somewhat complicated by his habit of revising, often extensively. By the time he discovered Vaucluse, however, he had written a good many of the individual poems that he was to include in the famous Epistolae Metricae, 66 letters in Latin hexameter verses, and some of the vernacular rhyme inspired by his love for Laura. At Vaucluse, he began to work on Africa, that famous poem, an epic poem on the subject of the Second Punic War. He also began to work on the De Viris Illustribus, intended as a series of biographies of heroes from the Roman history. Later, it was modified to include famous men of all time, beginning with Adam, as Petrarch's desire to emphasize the continuity among ideals of the Old Testament. He's trying to combine all this of the classical world and of the Christianity that increased. Meanwhile, his reputation as a scholar was spreading. In September 1340, he received invitations from Paris and Rome to be crowned as poet. He had perhaps sought out this honor partly from the ambition, but mainly in order that rebirth of the cult of poetry after more than 1,000 years might be fittingly celebrated. He had no hesitation in choosing Rome, and accordingly he was crowned on the Capitoline Hill on April 8, 1341. Afterward, placing his laurel wreath on the tomb of the apostle in St. Peter's Basilica, again the symbolic gesture linking the classical tradition with Christian message. From Rome, he went to Parma and the nearby solitude of Selva Piana, returning to Avignon in the autumn of 1343. It is generally believed that he went through some kind of moral crisis at this time, rooted in his inability to make his life conform to his religious faith and possibly heightened by his brother's decision to enter Carthusian monastery. At any rate, this is a common reading of the Secretum Meum 1342-43. It is an autobiographical treatise consisting of 3 dialogues between Petrarch and St. Augustine in the presence of truth. In it, he maintains hope that even amidst the worldly preoccupations and error, even while absorbed in himself and his own affairs, a man might still find a way to God. Thus, Petrarch's spiritual problem found a coherent solution, one that can be said to express the Petrarchan vision and humanists' religious and moral outlook. It was therefore an evolution, both moral and literary, rather than a crisis that made Petrarch decide his love for Laura was love for creature rather than for the creator, and therefore wrong. Proof of his attachment to the world. It was an evolution in his thinking that led him to break through the barriers of his too exclusive admiration for antiquity and to admit other authoritative voices as well. It was now, for example, that De Viris was enlarged to include material from sacred as well as secular history, while in the De Vita Solitaria, composed in 1346, he developed the theoretical basis and description of the solitary life, whereby man enjoys the consolations of nature and study together with those of prayer. The events of next few years are fundamental to his biography, to his evolution I mean, both as a man and as a writer. In the first place, he became enthusiastic for the efforts of Cola di Rienzo to revive the Roman Republic and restore popular government in Rome, a sympathy that divided him still more sharply from the Avignon court, and in 1346 even led to the loss of Cardinal Colonna's friendship. Plague of 1348, known as Black Death, saw many friends fall victim. Friends of Petrarch fall victim to it, including Laura, who died on April 6, the anniversary of Petrarch's first seeing her. Finally, in the Jubilee year of 1350, he made a pilgrimage to Rome and later assigned to this year his renunciation of sensual pleasures. In our terminology, he became an Indrajit. These are the landmarks of Petrarch's career. Because why we are referring to them? Because they had tremendous impact on the evolution of his personality as well as his academic oeuvre, academic endeavor. But the time in between was filled with diplomatic missions, study, and immense literary activity. In Verona, in 1345, he made his great discovery of the letters of Cicero to Atticus, two letters, Brutus and Quintus, which allowed him to penetrate the surface of the great orator and see the man himself, meaning thereby the psychological world of Cicero. The letters spurred him on to write epistles to the ancient authors whom he loved and to make a collection of his own letters that he had scattered among his friends. These great collections record not only Petrarch's genius for friendship but also all those shifts in his attitude by which he left behind the Middle Ages and prepared himself and the period for the Renaissance. Towards the end of 1345, he returned again to the peace of Vaucluse and spent 2 years there, chiefly revising the Vita Solitaria and also developing the theme of solitude in a specifically monastic context. In the Otio Religioso. Between November 1347 and his pilgrimage to Rome in 1350, about 3 years, he was also in Verona, Parma and Padua. Much of the time was spent in advancing his career in the church. The maneuvering and animosities this involved resulted in an intense longing for the peace of Vaucluse. Not even a visit from his lifelong friend, the poet Boccaccio, who offered him a chair to be established under his guidance in the University of Florence, could deflect him. He left Rome in May 1351 for Vaucluse.